if we're trying to understand why is this happening now? So obviously there's a background to this. Putin wants to make Russia great again, to restore the standing of the former Soviet Union, but he wanted to do that in 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18. So what's happened that's precipitating these events? Is it something that we did? Is it something some other Europeans did? Is it something that the Ukrainians did? Or is there something in the domestic politics or bureaucratic politics inside Russia? What do we think is driving the current confrontation?
As you said, long backstory. A lot of things could have happened along the way. Russia, in fact, invaded Georgia. Poor old Edward Shevardnadze was out by then, out of another job. And that was also in direct response in 2008 to Georgia's efforts, along with Ukraine, to become part of NATO at the April 2008 Bucharest summit. And that becomes the precursor, to a lot of efforts on the part of Russia, as you're suggesting, Graham, in the framing here, to make sure that Georgia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet states beyond the three Baltic states that had actually joined NATO in the 2000s did not become part of the alliance. And also one of the triggers for Ukraine being subject to Russian aggression again in 2014 in the annexation of Crimea that you discussed, and the outbreak of war in the Donbass, was Ukraine's attempt to have an association agreement with the European Union. And Russia saw that as potentially a backdoor into NATO. So there's a thread going on through all of this of Russia trying to prevent Ukraine and Georgia, by force if necessary, of becoming members of the NATO alliance. But why now, as you say? I mean, it wasn't like there was any chance of Ukraine getting into NATO formally, and there still isn't. But the Russians saw, and as they've said this quite clearly, NATO coming into Ukraine. What they meant by that is the prospect of NATO naval vessels. NATO obviously doesn't have its own naval vessels, but the naval vessels of NATO allies, members rather, appearing in Ukrainian ports. And one of the things that they said, that Putin said in 2014 when they annexed Crimea, Crimea being the home, traditionally of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, not just of Ukraine's Black Sea Fleet at the time, built up by Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and onwards, all the way since the Russian imperial time and the Soviet time, was that he could not foresee and could not tolerate and would not permit, as the rest of Russia would not, NATO vessels appearing in the storied ports of Sebastopol and others in Crimea and in the Black Sea. And we saw in the past several months more naval exercises by NATO allied forces in the Black Sea, an exercise known as Sea Breeze, and reports of the Russians firing shots at one of those vessels, the HMS Defender, a British vessel that sailed into the waters around Crimea, making a point that NATO and the rest of the world actually has not recognized Russia's annexation of Crimea. And the Russians wanting to make it clear that they were not going to tolerate any naval vessels approaching. That's one of many incidents. The others were the land exercise. It's been sending in of trainers, the submitting of kinds of ideas to Ukraine to help them build up their defensive capacity, revive their arms production centers, training and equipping to defend themselves against Russia. And although that hasn't been done as an explicit NATO operation, but it's been performed by trainers from the United States and Britain and other countries, and weapons sales, including drones from Turkey, which I think have been quite significant, to the Ukrainian armed forces. And for Russia, that's just unpermissible. And one of the other triggers for what we've seen today was Ukraine using a drone that the Turks had sold to them in an operation across the line of contact in Donbass, where, of course, there's a war going on that Russia triggered back in 2014 as well. But I think, more than that, it's all of the above, the other things that you said there. So it's the impermissibility of any form of contact between Ukraine and NATO, backdoor, as well as open door, it's kind of whatever way. Russia said, no, not happening. And, they've already invaded Georgia and they've already invaded Ukraine. So we know that, that they mean business when they say that's not going to happen. So we have to take that seriously. We've also had a shift in the way that the US rhetoric has been about Ukraine. I mean, think back to the Trump administration, the experience that I had, people might remember at the first impeachment trial. What was that about? That was about Ukraine. A phone call, a perfect phone call, or not so perfect phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine, still with us, for now, basically asking him to do, this is Trump asking Zelensky to do him a favor on domestic politics. So you had in the Trump administration a policy toward Ukraine that was all over the place. It was business most unusual and personal business for Trump, asking Zelensky to do him a favor to try to, basically attack Joe Biden, now President Biden, and his son Hunter Biden, by opening up all kinds of corruption investigations into them. So Ukraine was part of our domestic politics, and the Russians probably didn't like that, but it wasn't like then Ukraine was kind of seen as some strategic object. When the Biden administration comes in, President Biden understandably wants to put all of that rubbish about him and his son Hunter Biden behind him, and he wants to go back to business as usual with Ukraine. Ukraine as a partner, Ukraine is a part of normal US national security and foreign policy, and the Russians react to that because we have a flurry of statements about Ukraine. Ukraine matters to the United States. We defend its independence and sovereignty, although to be honest we have very limited ways of doing that. We get back to arms sales, but Trump was trying to keep hold back in return for this favor, dangling those out. And we have visits by Secretary of Defense Austin, General Austin, and a whole host of other things going on, and the Russians really see this together with all of the NATO activity. This gets back to is there something that we did, Graham? Yeah, we went back to business as usual on Ukraine and all the normal statements, and the Russians are like, we've had it, that is not going to happen. We've been saying this for a very long time. Don't you remember that we invaded Georgia back in 2008? NATO's not allowed in. And, what's this? What does Ukraine matter to you is what Russians have been saying. I've had that said to me directly when I was in my previous position. And it matters to us more. We've even have Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, a very serious, extremely talented Russian diplomat who's been at the forefront of these recent talks.
The person who's now been talking to, he's the one that met with Wendy Sherman.
Exactly. He's the key interlocutor of the US government, actually saying that Ukraine's security matters more to Russia than it does to Ukraine. So that's really emphasizing, where we are in all of this. And then it's all these other issues. Just quickly, the United States is seen as weak by Russia. We've pulled out of Afghanistan in a rather shambolic way, so they see us in retreat. President Biden's agenda at home has been very difficult under challenge. He has fights with his own party, let alone with the Republican Party. We're shortly going to have the midterms, and we're going to be all over the place again from the Russian perspective. Then there's China, your current issue that you focused on. Not only they're worried about the Thucydides trap, the kind of conflict between US and China, but actually Russia doesn't like the fact that the US is fixated with China. And we're trying to park them somewhere over. Our colleague, another Harvard graduate, Angela Stent, said this, very publicly. We were trying to put Russia in a car park, and Russia was just trying to burst out of it. They want our undivided attention, and they want the resolution now of Ukraine's status, as whether NATO expands further or does not, and they want a ironclad guarantee, but they want something much bigger than that as well. This is about, as you would say in one of your classes, and as going back to me in 1989 and 1991 in my studies at Harvard, about the total disposition of the state of affairs, missiles, forces, you name it, after the Cold War. They want a different post-Cold War settlement. They don't like the last 30 years. They want a redo. And they want to have us agree to that now. So we're in a really difficult position now because of a whole confluence of a factor of things, the perceived weakness. There's also all the frictions in Europe right now. Will Boris Johnson go or not go because of partying in the United Kingdom during COVID? Poland's on the outs with the European Union. There's all these frictions in NATO with Turkey and with Poland and Hungary and other kind of countries as well, and spats all over the place. This seems to be the time to go for Russia to resolve this once and for all. And I think for Putin this is personal. And I think he's worried himself about his own future perspective. He has to be re-elected. Obviously, it looks like it might be a shoo-in in 2024, but I think he just wants to get this over and done with now. And he's sick of, basically dealing with successive US governments who, in his view, don't really pay attention. And I know that from my time in the National Security Council, they were so frustrated that we could never agree on anything.
So if if the president were saying to you, Fiona, think about it, what are my options now? And what do you recommend? I mean, you could send American forces to defend Ukraine and maybe have a war with Russia over Ukraine. And then how would that work out? Well, okay, so now next, you could, I think the British are today said to be sending C-17s with additional arms to Ukraine. And so how would that work out? Or you could tell Putin, forget about it. We're not going to, we're not going to deal with this. And how would that work out? Or maybe you have a better idea. So what to do?
Well, look, I think, from the British perspective, this has shades of, the opening, and this isn't very comfortable or comforting for everyone to hear this, as the kind of opening salvos of World War II, when Nazi Germany went into Poland. And, obviously there's a long shadow of the, the history of appeasement, Munich, 1938, Anthony Eden, Chamberlain, let's just say, the Brits have seen a lot of this before. And what, of course, happened after, Germany went into Poland in 1939, an awful lot of Poles retreated to London. And, look, I think the Russians think, bring it on, we can do this. We can go in, and Ukraine refugees will not flow to Russia. Clearly, they have from Donbass, but this is often, kind of Russian speakers have now been given Russian passports, by the way. So one pretext for the Russians to do something is, from some reports, there's 600,000 residents of Donbass have been given Russian passports. You and I, Graham, have seen this scenario many times where the Russians intervene in defense of Russian speakers, Russian citizens, so they could have a pretext. Hitler used the same pretext, with Sudetenland and, various things as well. History has seen this play before. The British Secretary of Defense has called it out. There's a really excellent statement that's coming out, just saying, look, this is all a straw man. No one's encircling Russia. Only 6% of Russian territory actually borders on NATO. That tiny little sliver of border with Norway directly, across, from Murmansk in, the high north, Lithuania and Poland, kind of surrounding Kaliningrad, which of course used to be part of Germany, East Prussia, and then Estonia and Latvia, kind of borders. So this is it. It's not like, Russia is really encircled by NATO. But of course, the Russians are saying if Ukraine gets in, then that's, kind of different. But, let's just say, the UK is calling it out. And this, for them, it's shades of the past when they didn't act. And so, they feel that they need to act. So, look, we could take it that way and, put it into that historical context and, kind of then, kind of think about these individual acts of defense. And as you say, how is that going to turn out? The Russians have shown that they will not be deterred by the thought of high casualties. But think of Chechnya. You and I, Graham, worked on Chechnya back in the 1990s, a war between Moscow and one of its own republics, in which hundreds of thousands of people died. And, the city regional capital of Grozny was leveled. And most of the people who died were actually Russian speakers, ethnic Russians, particularly elderly ladies trapped in the basements during, carpet bombing by, Russian aviation and shelling. So, let's just say there's not the same sort of threshold that other countries have. And the Russians have already shown determination to invade and, try to go further, in Ukraine. And again, they figure refugees will go over into others' borders. They'll, the Ukrainian military might retreat into Poland, for example, replaying many of the scenarios we've seen in the military. So we'd have to have, in the military past, we'd have to have a pretty strong stomach for this. And of course, the Russians are betting that everyone in Europe is going to be panicked at the thought of World War III, although, we argue we've already been in it for some time. We've had a lot of wars for, the last 2 decades. Different fronts, and the devastation of another European country, because Ukraine is part of that. They also figure that Europe won't want to react because they've got Europe where they want it in an energy crisis right now. The Europeans didn't build up their gas storage for the winter. There'd be an awful lot of hesitation on the part of Europeans to really respond if Russia does that. After the war, we set up the United Nations system to try to push back against these kinds of eventualities. So there is a bigger diplomatic effort that we could undertake that goes beyond just European security and thinking of this as a spat between the US and Russia. over what happened in the 1990s when, the Soviet Union and Russia retreated from Europe, had to take its troops, its missiles, its bases away, and, get back, closer to home, although, they stayed in Kaliningrad, obviously because it's an exclave of Russia, and that this is all about the future of NATO and, the future of Europe. This would be a massive challenge to the entire system after World War II that underpinned the United Nations. This looks like Iraq going into Kuwait in 1990, because, basically Iraq said Kuwait isn't a country. Iraq, should have had Kuwait. Those oil fields were supposed to be ours. That's just a bunch of Brits and French and people dividing up, the Middle East after World War I. We're not going to pay any attention to it. We had UN resolutions. That first time that we did something about Iraq, the first time, not the second time, which was pretty dodgy, to say the least. The first time we had UN backing for something much bigger. What we need now is to put this out there as a bigger issue, because the Russians say this is all a fight between NATO and the United States and Russia. And actually, this is all about the sovereignty and independence of a state that's been recognized for the last 30 years as, part of the UN General Assembly, part of the UN system, a part of the international system, not just part of the European system. And if this can happen to Ukraine, frankly, it can happen to every other country, not just former Soviet states that belong to, some kind of imperial, system, up until the Cold War, or, kind of even, the end of World War II.
Who will fight for Ukraine? Will Americans send American troops to fight for the Donbass or Luhansk? No. Okay. I think the chance of that is nearly zero. And I would vote against it for me. Okay. So is there any European country that's going to send troops to fight Russia in Ukraine? I don't think so. So Russia has a military trump card with respect to Ukraine that it can play. Now that then, for me, drives me back to, well, is there some diplomatic reformulation of the situation, either with respect to Ukraine or the bigger picture, that could be feasible? And if so, could you get from here to there, given where we are now?
Look, the Russians are taking this to a bigger place as well. They're going back into your territory, Graham. Emma referred to your dissertation, your PhD. It was about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which the Russians call the Caribbean Crisis. And we've just seen some threats recently that they're talking about sending, again, in your wheelhouse of nuclear weapons, Zircon, sea-launched hypersonic missiles to Cuba and Venezuela, they've said, to kind of bring this home. And in 2019, when I was at the National Security Council, you might recall the Russians moved 100 plus guys on a plane into Venezuela when they thought the US was going to press Maduro to leave. And then they started offering behind the scenes a swap. We'll get out of Venezuela, you get out of Ukraine, and, kind of promise NATO to get out of Ukraine. And I was sent to Moscow to kind of talk to them about that and say, no, Venezuela's not ours. We don't want Venezuela. This is not, the days of, the CIA, they believe that it still is. We do have a bit of pressure that we put on our neighbors, that's the Canadians and the Mexicans, but we're not in that old game of Bay of Pigs, 1960s anymore. And, this is not where we're going. That was not our discussion about Venezuela. It was not about, US, Russia trading off. And we're not going to trade Ukraine for Venezuela. But they're doing this again. And they're also rattling affairs out in the Asia Pacific. If you, look very closely, as I know you have, on Russian commentary, they're saying that, kind of the United States should pull out of Japan as well. Because Russia is an Asia Pacific power, the Sea of Okhotsk, not just the Barents, the Baltic and the Black Sea, is Russian. They've fired apparently on a US ship going through the disputed waters of the Kuril Islands, another area that you and I did work on, back in the 1990s. I'm really glad I did all these things, by the way, because otherwise I wouldn't have all this, knowledge for how they're putting it all together. And here they are basically saying, well, maybe the US should pull out of Okinawa. And they're stirring the pot. So they've gone bigger, to basically get us to do something on Ukraine and Europe. And we need to, broaden that aperture as well of diplomacy at the very least. So, my advice would be now, do that now, get ahead of it, because then we, would have other countries that are also agreeing that they need to defend in some fashion Ukraine's independence and sovereignty.
Ukraine is a sovereign independent country, but as a sovereign independent country, if Ukraine has to try to deal with Russia as a sovereign independent country that can use its military force to coerce Ukraine, it can. We can arm Ukraine further, but to a degree that Russia will not be able to coerce Ukraine successfully? I don't think so. So then we could fight for Ukraine, but we're not going to do that because it's not, we think, if the alternative is Russia absorbs Ukraine or Americans kill and die to preserve Ukraine, I don't think the US, I don't think it's in America's national interest to do that.
I'm not talking about
I
the
don't
United
think-
States.
no,
I'm
I don't
talking
think
about the
anybody-
United
I
Nations.
don't think, and
Yeah.
the UN is going to do nothing.
My point is that Russia is doing, and you're unfortunately doing what they want, which is it's all about us talking about Ukraine. That's in the tactical weeds.
Right.
Russia is being strategic. It's about us, about the United States. It's about pushing us out of Europe. It's about getting rid of NATO. And they're using Ukraine as a hostage, and they're dragging us all down to talk about what we're going to do about poor Ukraine.
I agree.
Well, we have to put it out there in a larger thing and saying, look, sorry, you're going to have to talk to lots of others as well. It can't be about the United States because they're dragging us in to the old World War II, sitting, there in chairs or across tables in some setting that they're saying that they have a right. Look, and if we let them do that, everybody else will be doing that as well. And they're making it about us. They're saying all the time, well, what about you, the United States? You did this, Haiti, Panama, Nicaragua, Cuba, you're always doing it. We had articles in the press in the United States used to admit that it's a bad actor and, okay, well, why has that got to do with Ukraine? What's Ukraine got to do with anything? Why should Ukraine be punished because we're a bad actor? So, again, we need to be more creative and we need to be bigger in our diplomacy is, kind of really what I'm arguing here. And again, it might not work because, as you say, this is probably pretty insolvable in many respects because they've been so maximalist in their demands, Russia, that we can't see what the minimum floor is here. And, kind of to get to any kind of minimum floor, which might be about the dismemberment of Ukraine or the handing over Ukraine to Russia, that is a pretty unpalatable thing to do for broader international security. So this is going to be a tough one.